Okay, good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? All right. Okay, these are my disclaimers. This is very similar to the other two speakers that went before me, so I won't go through them. I will be showing a lot of examples throughout the next 45 minutes to an hour. And I guess I should point out that this is not an endorsement for any of these products. We've de-identified these and modified them slightly, but you may be able to recognize some of them because they're from recently approved products. So again, not templates, but just examples to illustrate broad concepts. So the learning objectives, we're going to talk about adverse reactions. We'll first talk about what this means from a regulatory standpoint. We want to identify key regulatory requirements. We can't cover all of them, but we're going to lay some groundwork so that we can discuss some more special select topics and challenges. We'll talk about content and format approaches for presenting adverse reaction data in the adverse reaction section. That's what I'm going to primarily focus on because that's where the vast majority of risk information is included. And then we're going to recognize some of the challenges and considerations for presenting adverse reaction related information in the labeling. So the purpose of adverse reaction information as labeling is to inform prescribing decisions in patient management. Remember, as Eric had mentioned, labeling is geared towards the healthcare practitioner. And so even though the document could be used widely and by patient and family members and other groups, our primary audience for the PI is the healthcare practitioner. So that's what you should keep in mind when you decide whether information is appropriate to include, how to write, how to craft this section, how to develop it, what language to use, what knowledge to assume, and what the purpose of the information serves is. And in the box, this is a commonly cited regulation. This is broadly across, it applies to all sections of labeling and everything in the labeling. And adverse reaction information is no different. So it has to be informative and accurate and not misleading in any way. With that in mind, the regulations makes a distinction between adverse reactions and adverse events. These are two different concepts. So adverse events is everything that's reported that's untoward, that's undesirable, unfavorable, all events that are reported in your period of observation. Distinct from that is adverse reactions. From a regulatory standpoint, what we're interested in is those events that are, this is the way it's defined, reasonably associated with use of the drug. And so that's to point out the difference that you don't want to include everything under the sun that may not be informative. And another way to say it is that events for which there is some basis to believe a causal relationship between the drug and the occurrence of the adverse event. If you notice in the diagram, that tiny circle represents the events for which causal relationship is definitively established. That's really not the typical case, and that's not what we're after. So we don't wait for causal relationship to be defined and established before we call it an adverse reaction. It's kind of impossible to do that. So how do we distinguish between adverse reactions and adverse events? These are a number of different aspects that you consider. So frequency of reporting, how it relates to the placebo rate, extent of dose response. If you have a drug that varies, the adverse reaction varies with the dose, if there's a dose-response relationship. Whether it's related to the pharmacology of the drug or your understanding of the drug and it makes sense, that could help. But other factors as well. One thing that the adverse reaction guidance discourages is over-reliance on individual investigator judged drug-related adverse events, and that's just to get away from the potential for bias. So instead, the guidance recommends that the adverse reaction rate be ordinarily derived from all reported adverse events. And I just wanted to emphasize derived from, because as we mentioned, it's not a one-to-one relationship. It's not that the AR rate is all the reported adverse events. Again, there's some processing and assessment of that information further to ensure that what you're reporting as an adverse reaction is actually clinically meaningful. One of the things that you would be doing when you're assessing the adverse events further to see if there are adverse reactions is also seeing whether certain terms can be grouped, if they make sense to group them. And that sort of helps to whittle down the adverse event, body of adverse events down into more meaningful terms that might represent a single physiologic phenomenon. So in this example, for instance, upper respiratory infections encompasses a bunch of reported adverse events or adverse reactions. Nasopharyngitis, pharyngitis, rhinitis, anything that you think in this particular context could be grouped together and reported out as a slightly higher number rather than diluting it out and reporting several different adverse reactions. Okay, so now that we've defined what an adverse reaction is, where is this information included in the labeling? It could really be included anywhere throughout the labeling, maybe with the exception of some product quality sections. Here is just a listing. This is not all-inclusive. We're going to focus primarily on Section 6, which is the title of which is Adverse Reactions. That's where the bulk of information is. And so I'm going to focus on the content and format requirements and recommendations for Section 6, Adverse Reactions. But again, it can be found throughout the labeling in various other sections as well. Okay, so some of the basics. What are the required pieces of information and requirements for organization of Section 6 adverse reactions? So Section 6 has to list the adverse reactions that occur with the drug and also with drugs in the same class, if applicable. This doesn't always have to be, you don't always have to report out adverse reactions for all the other members of a drug class if it's not necessary to do so. So if you have a drug that's been well studied and its database furnishes enough information that you find that information representative sufficiently of what the adverse reactions would be, then you report that, and you don't need to report redundant information coming from other members of that class. The regulations also stipulates how to categorize adverse reactions, and this is going to be grouped into two large buckets: clinical trials experience and post-marketing experience. And this is based on the type of data. We're getting at the quality of the underlying data than the timing or the source, whether it's post-marketing or pre-marketing, or the source, meaning is it from the literature, is it from the company safety database, is it reported directly to the FDA? It's not so much based on those factors as it is the type of data and the quality of that data. Okay, so within, as we said, two buckets, clinical trials experience and post-marketing experience. Within the clinical trials experience group, you want to present the adverse reaction rates for both the drug and the comparator, for example, placebo. And the exception to this would be if you can't determine the rates for the comparator, or if you think the presentation of those comparator rates is misleading. And the guidance gives an example of what they mean by misleading. So for example, if an excessive dose was used for the active comparator, which might make your drug look seriously safer than the active comparator, that's an example of misleading. But there's other ways that you could imagine that if you present the data, it might be misinterpreted to mean that one drug might be safer than the other. And if you think there's any, if you have any doubt and you think that there might be misinterpretation, then include a disclaimer statement as a footnote or in the text stating that the data reflected in the table or in the text are not an adequate basis for comparison of adverse reaction rates between drug X and drug Y. This is just a pictorial to illustrate the balance that has to be struck between furnishing information, which is required. As we said, you have to, by regulations, provide adverse reaction rates for the drug and the comparator from clinical trials, weighing that against the regulation required restrictions on potential safety claims. So according to the regulations, if you're to compare the safety of one drug against another in terms of adverse reactions, it has to be based on adequate and well-controlled trials. And for biological products, the same thing, based on substantial evidence, or similar, based on substantial evidence. And so these two competing requirements at times can be difficult to navigate, but again, as we said, it can be easily solved by adding a disclaimer statement. If you think that presenting the information as required could potentially be misinterpreted as comparative information for drug X versus drug Y, just put in a disclaimer saying that the data are not an adequate basis for that comparison. Okay, so before you provide the adverse reaction listings, it has to be preceded by information necessary to interpret those adverse reactions. So this information is going to include, of course, the total exposure, total size of the database with the numbers of patients exposed, the extent and nature of exposure, so the dosing schedule, the duration, how many patients were exposed for 6 months, let's say, and how many for a year, but also include demographics and disease severity characteristics. That's commonly pretty obvious. One thing that people often forget to include or state are the important exclusions from the safety database. And so here's an example of a drug where, after describing the exposures and the demographics, here it goes into the important exclusions. So here, patients with unstable cardiac disease, narrow angle glaucoma, symptomatic prostatic hypertrophy, and bladder outlet obstruction were excluded from these trials. And that's to help the provider know that when you look at the adverse reactions in Section 6, it may not be representative of what you would expect if you were to prescribe this drug for a patient that has any of these conditions, because they just weren't studied in the trial. Another piece many of you are familiar with, this is the standard disclaimer statement that starts off Section 6.1, and it basically tells you that the clinical trials in general are conducted under widely varying conditions, and so you should not compare rates of the clinical trials of one drug against the rates of another drug, and it may not reflect what you'd see in practice. And so this is part of serving the requirement to include information preceding the adverse reactions that helps you interpret the adverse reactions that you present. And down at the bottom of the slide, this is taken from 2 different drugs. These are recently approved therapies for migraine, the treatment of prevention of migraine, preventative treatment of migraine. And you can see that these 2 drugs are both biologics with a similar mechanism of action. And you'll see that, just as an example, the placebo rates vary widely, right? So placebo monthly on one of them was 13% and another was 38%. And so you wouldn't want a provider to go and compare, the injection site reactions. For one is 18%, the other is 43%. That's kind of a meaningless takeaway point. So you don't want to be comparing across drugs in their labeling. And so that's the purpose of this disclaimer. Okay, so let's turn now to adverse reaction listings and the topic of how to select the rate cutoff. So when you go to present your adverse reaction listing as a reviewer or as the one preparing and drafting the draft labeling, you have to make a decision where to cut off that listing and what are some of the considerations for that. Okay, so as a reminder, Section 6 is meant to cover the entire safety database. So even though you're not going to be summarizing all the information exhaustively that you know about the drug from a safety standpoint, you have to ensure that your communication of the drug's safety is covered, and that covers everything that you know about the drug gleaned from the entire safety database during development. So again, you're not summarizing all of that information, but it does cover that knowledge base. Okay, and then what you actually do come to present would be the listing identified from select clinical trials that you think are appropriate to use as representation of that knowledge of the entire safety database of the drug. So the cutoff rate would be expected to vary between drugs and between indications. Of course, if you have a drug that's cytotoxic or heavily toxic, you would expect that your safety tolerance, and it's going to be used in a patient population for whom they have a serious or life-threatening disease, you would expect that you would have a higher threshold of safety of adverse reactions in order to treat their disease. And conversely, if you have a condition that's not serious or life-threatening, maybe your threshold for safety events would be a lot lower, or for toxicity really is a lot lower. But other factors are involved. So size of the safety database, if you have a very large study, obviously the confidence in your findings is going to be higher. If you have a very small study size, then with just small variations in the number of patients that are reporting these adverse events, you can see wild fluctuations in the adverse reaction rate. And so you might have to lower your threshold, your cutoff a little bit to catch all of the potential adverse reactions. There's different considerations with that. Designs of the trial in the database, if you have a trial that's active controlled versus placebo controlled, we'll get into that, some of the considerations. If your trial duration is very long compared to one that's short, you will have a longer observation period. So just by virtue of that longer study duration, you're going to have adverse reaction rates that are higher across the board in both groups. And so you would have to select a higher, slightly higher cutoff. And finally, the disease and condition, we kind of mentioned that already. If you have a serious and life-threatening disorder, then you're going to have a higher tolerance for toxicity. Whatever your cutoff is that you select, it should be clearly noted in the labeling. It should be either in the text or as a header for the table or the listing, or as a footnote to the table. And provide the denominators for everyone to know what the size of that database or grouping was. Okay, so as we mentioned, how the drug's adverse reaction rate is compared to the comparator is one consideration. So the guidance recommends that you should include the adverse reaction in the listing when the adverse reaction rate of the drug is greater than placebo. And if it's less than or equal to placebo, you would omit it from the listing, unless you think there's some other compelling factor that makes it a suspected adverse reaction. So for instance, if the timing or other factors suggest that despite the fact that you saw the rate at a lower incidence than placebo, you still think it's an adverse reaction, you can include that. But if you do include that, don't include it within the table together with the other adverse reactions that were higher in the drug compared to the placebo. Take it out and discuss it separately in the commentary at the bottom of the table. Because otherwise, if you present those numbers with it lower than placebo, somebody might read that and think that it's a non-issue, that it's not an adverse reaction, which is the opposite message of what you would be wanting to deliver. Okay, I want to note that this above approach does not account for chance findings in either direction, so this is not a statistically rigorous piece of advice. This is just practically how we do this. Safety operates with descriptive statistics most of the times because it's impossible to test there's no need to, and it's impossible to test every comparison on every adverse reaction rate unless you specifically design your study to look for things. And so this is a descriptive statistical type of recommendation from the guidance. If you have an active, this is for drug versus placebo. If your comparator is an active comparator, then this doesn't apply, or it may not apply, and you have to choose your appropriate rate depending on what your situation is. So for instance, if you have drug X is your drug, and drug Y is the comparator, and it's an active control. If your study is drug X versus drug Y, and you choose your cutoff, you don't want to say above 10, all adverse reactions above 10%, and drug X greater than drug Y. You may not want to say that because then you might be excluding things that are truly adverse reactions. It's just that the adverse reaction rate of drug X did not exceed drug Y. So for active comparators, you may choose just a certain cutoff and not require that the drug have a worse reaction rate than the comparator. On the other hand, if you have an active comparator, but your drug is an add-on therapy, so you have your treatment arms are drug X versus drug Y plus drug X, so add-on therapy, then you could use what the paradigm here described for drug versus placebo, because you want to make sure that you're reporting out things where the drug is actually contributing to the adverse reaction. Okay, so leave out statistical significance testing if you haven't powered the study to test a specific hypothesis and it's not powered or designed to make conclusions. So this is an example of what we just talked about. So everything here is fine. If you notice back pain, the rate in drug X is 12 versus placebo is 13. Take that out. It doesn't mean that it's reassuring. Like we said, this is descriptive statistics, and this is just what was observed to date. And the mechanism in place to address this uncertainty about whether it really is or isn't an adverse reaction is that we update labeling periodically. It's required that when new information comes in and you discover a new safety signal, as Eric mentioned in his talk, that labeling be updated. So as soon as you have any hint of back pain actually being an adverse reaction, then you would add it at that point. So excluding it here is not to say that it doesn't exist as an adverse reaction. It's just that you have no evidence yet to include it. Okay, here is another topic about how to present the data, categorizing and ordering it within a listing. The way it's displayed here is perfectly fine. You can order it based on frequency without any further designations or categorization. But when listings start to get long, and you can start to categorize them in order to make the information easier to digest and recognize. So here, neutropenia, thrombocytopenia, anemia, lymphopenia, you can combine these all together, and the infectious diseases can be combined together. The regulations has a lot of flexibility, so categorization can be by body system, severity of the adverse reactions, or by decreasing frequency or a combination, whatever is appropriate to your situation. Laboratory adverse reaction, this is particularly a good area where you would want to categorize things. So hematology, laboratory abnormalities together, and chemistry together, it's pretty self-explanatory. And here in this example, you'll note that the cutoff point that was chosen is different here for all grades, and then specify 10% for all grades and 5%, for instance, for grade 3 or 4. Okay, you want to use the best available data. So one of the principles outlined in the guidance is that you don't have to be showing exhaustively all the data that you have available, because in the beginning that may not be that as apparent, but as you start to get a drug that's out there for a while and you start adding indications one by one, the labeling starts to get very long, unnecessarily long. And so if you have already developed in your section 6 an adverse reaction listing, a table that shows and is representative across the board, across various different indications, you don't need to repeat that. If you think you can refer back to it and say that in indication 2, the adverse reaction profile was consistent with that shown in table 1 for another indication. And so sometimes people don't always know that you can abbreviate a little bit and sort of synthesize across indications, but we actually encourage that because the busy healthcare provider is not going to have time to look through a very, very long labeling if not necessary. So here in this example, study 1 is against placebo, and that's probably the optimal type of study to use to ferret out between adverse reaction and adverse events. If your study size is sufficiently large here, there's like 7,000 patients total, 3,500 exposed to drug X. So probably you could get away with just presenting study 1. But again, this is not to comment on if anyone recognizes what drug this is from. This is not to comment on this particular product. There could be good reasons for including an adverse reaction table where the drug is compared against an active control. So again, these are just considerations and the recommendations in the guidance. Okay, so turning to subgroup adverse reaction information and for multiple indications. So some of the principles that we just talked about using representative data apply here, and we kind of touched on this. Here's an example of a drug that has 2 separate indications. One is for migraine, and then subsequently another indication came in for episodic cluster headache. The only adverse reaction, it's a pretty benign drug, a pretty non-toxic drug. Most of the adverse reactions, the only one listed was injection site reactions. And so it was decided, and that was the largest study size. The studies were larger in migraine. So despite the fact that the populations were slightly different, most of them were female in the migraine population, most were male in the episodic cluster indication. And the drug dose was also different, 120 milligrams once monthly compared to more than twice that, 300 a month. And also a different duration, 6 months for migraine and 2 months for episodic cluster headache. Despite those differences, after you outline those differences, if you find that the presentation of adverse reactions is sufficiently consistent with what was already developed earlier, you can simply refer back to that. So here it says, overall, the safety profile observed in patients with episodic cluster headache treated with drug X 300 milligrams monthly was consistent with the safety profile in migraine patients. And so that's kind of a short and sweet way to include the necessary information without too much repetition. So again, to summarize, so multiple indications, a single adverse reaction table may be adequate, and this is similar to what we just talked about in a single indication where you have multiple studies, you can just choose the representative study and then include anything else from the studies that were additionally seen. If you're going to use more than one adverse reaction table, you can consider focusing the additional tables on the additional information with adverse reaction rate differences, and then make a note that this table only includes adverse reactions that were not included. I think that's a little bit more confusing, that this is a recommendation from the guidance. Typically, we don't really see that because I think it's helpful to include it in context. If you take it out from where it belongs with the rest of the adverse reactions, it may be hard to follow. But again, these are considerations. Okay, so the same concept applies when there are different demographic subgroups, dosage forms, dosing regimens, and so on. Here's an example where the adverse reaction in a subgroup with renal impairment was commented on. In this particular, this is in studies 1 and 2, which were the efficacy studies, a subgroup with renal impairment was analyzed separately and found to have a higher incidence of diarrhea, including severe diarrhea. And here's the table showing that breakdown. And again, the denominators are shown so people can see the sample, the subgroup size. Here's an example where gender-specific adverse reactions were seen. And the guidance recommends that when you have gender-specific adverse reactions, include the denominator and include it either in the text or as a footnote. So here, this drug in females, vulvovaginal mycotic infection and vulvovaginal candidiasis were seen, and the percentages are given. But according to the guidance, it would be helpful to include denominators as well. In this case, you could still find the information if you go down to section 14 and find out what percentage of the total was female, and then do a little calculation. But the safety population and the efficacy population tend to be a little bit different, so it's an approximation. And to obviate all this extra work, just provide the denominators in the labeling. Okay, so other topics that didn't belong in the other sections and other requirements. So when you have adverse reactions that have significant clinical implications, and that would be, for instance, if the adverse reaction might influence dose changes, dose modifications, dose discontinuation of therapy, the listings have to be supplemented with additional details if the data are available and important. And this type of information would include the nature of the adverse reaction, frequency or severity of the adverse reaction. And this is to be discussed as commentary beneath the table. Also, if for these same types of adverse reactions that have significant clinical implications, the regulations requires that it be discussed if there's a relationship to drug dose or demographics. I'm sorry, talking away from the microphone. Drug dose or demographics. And this, again, is either in the commentary or if you have a drug that has dose-response relationship, consider including this in a table of its own, particularly if you have a drug where dose selection is allowed, if you're titrating doses. This example is actually an example where this particular drug has a starting dose of either 37.5 milligrams or 75 milligrams, but can be titrated upwards to 150 maximum. Showing this table of adverse reactions is if you have a patient with showing these particular adverse reactions, you can decide how to titrate the drug accordingly. Okay, also by regulations, if adverse reactions that occur below that cutoff rate that you specify are included, if they are included, they must be included as a separate listing. So you would take those less common adverse reactions, separate them out, and discuss them in the commentary. And so here's an example of that. Other adverse reactions reported in less than 1% of patients are such and such. Okay, long-term extension study data. So this is a recommendation and not, this is not from regulations, this is a recommendation or consideration for you. If you have long-term extension study data that's uncontrolled, include information that shows new adverse reactions or the same adverse reaction, the existing adverse reactions of greater severity or frequency. And we want to try to avoid overstating claims about the long-term safety being comparable to the shorter-term trials, because if these long-term extension studies did not have a control arm and did not have randomization, and you are limited in the amount of conclusions you can make, you don't want to be stating that. So in other words, limit it to positive findings, and if at all possible, stay silent about similarities to shorter-term data if this information is coming from uncontrolled extension studies. And just to point out, this is different from long-term safety studies. So for instance, if you have a drug where you study it in shorter efficacy studies, and then you have maybe one longer-term safety study that's controlled. So for instance, COPD is an example that came to mind. Then you can make statements about the adverse reaction because it's controlled and you have more confidence in the data. You can include information about being comparable to the shorter-term treatment. Okay, so moving to adverse reactions, heading in the highlights. So according to the regulation, the highlights heading adverse reactions is to have a list of the most frequently occurring adverse reactions along with the criteria used to determine inclusion. So the incidence rate, which is normally in parentheses. So just in case to highlight the difference, Section 6 is the common adverse reactions and the less common. And in highlights, you want to highlight only the most common adverse reactions. One issue that we sometimes come across is that people sometimes forget that adverse reactions that are laboratory in nature are also considered adverse reactions. So according to the guidance, it's defined adverse reactions as it can include signs and symptoms, changes in laboratory parameters, and also other measures like vital signs and EKGs. So these are all adverse reactions. You don't have to limit it to just what's reported by the investigator. Here's an example where it was decided that adverse reactions are only reported for non-laboratory adverse reactions, but you could consider whether you want to include laboratory reactions as well. Here's one where if you decide to bring it into the highlights, you would want to decide, are you going to put it together in one listing or are you going to put it in two different listings? And one of the considerations is if you have a lot of, let's say you have a drug here that has a lot of laboratory abnormalities, and you want to, in order to fit it in the highlights, which is limited in length to half a page, you want to use a higher cutoff. So if you're going to choose different cutoffs for non-laboratory and laboratory adverse reactions, then you could list them separately. And when you do this, use bulleted format, which is required by regulation for highlights. And this is just an example of the inclusion of laboratory abnormalities together with the non-laboratory abnormalities in a single bullet, which is fine also. When you have different dosage forms, consider whether the adverse reaction profile is adequately represented using just one form, or whether you want to present them both separately. So here, drug X had an injection form as well as tablet form, and they have slightly different adverse reaction profiles, so you can have two different bullets to present this information. And again, use bulleted formats when you have two different subheadings in highlights. Okay, so Section 6 versus Section 14. Usually information is in Section 6, that's adverse reactions. Section 14 is clinical studies information. But in some cases, it's unclear where the information should go. And this represents how I feel, or I don't know, maybe how you feel about sometimes figuring out which section to put adverse reaction information into. And this is we're talking mostly about studies that prospectively evaluate a safety endpoint. So pre-specified safety endpoints. Sometimes it's unclear, is it in 6 or is it in 14? And if you're curious to know that behind this graphic, these are all excerpts from either the regulations or guidance. If you have time to look at it, there's a slide at the end in my backup slides where you can read the information here. And it can be confusing, and really the takeaway is that there's flexibility. So you could probably make an argument, depending on your particular scenario, for reasonably including it in Section 6 or 14. But if you're confused, the upside of that is that you have flexibility. And so what's one way that you could consider approaching this? And again, there's flexibility. So this is just one potential approach. So you can ask yourself, where is a prescriber likely to look for this safety information? And this is going to be dependent on the study findings. So if your study looked to evaluate a pre-specified safety endpoint, and it ended up showing that the drug's adverse reaction rate is lower than an active comparator, but it was still an adverse reaction nonetheless. You can consider including that data in Section 6, because Section 6's purpose is to furnish information about the adverse reactions to be expected with use of the drug. So even though it is what was found to be safer than another drug, it's still an adverse reaction. So consider in that scenario putting that data in Section 6 because it's an adverse reaction. On the other hand, in the same study, if you were to have designed your study to look for a safety endpoint and you found that not only was the drug safer than another drug, it was actually a non-adverse reaction, or maybe it was there was clinical benefit. So I have examples, so maybe I can move on to show the examples with these points. But basically, if you have study results that show that reassure that something is not an adverse reaction, you could consider presenting that data in Section 14 because it's not an adverse reaction. Either way, you would use cross-references. As mentioned in the previous talks, cross-references are very much liked and very much encouraged when they help direct the reader to related data in other sections that help complete the picture or give you more details. So, if you present it in Section 6, cross-reference to 14 for details of the study design and other details, if it's coming from an efficacy study that's described in Section 14. If 14, you just decide to cross-reference to Section 6 and include the data in Section 6, the cross-referencing will assure that regardless of where you particularly choose to put it, the information will be found. Okay, so here's an example of a drug that is, this is a novel oral anticoagulant drug, and it has bleeding-related adverse reactions. These were adjudicated by a central committee. The comparator arm is enoxaparin switched to warfarin. This is for an indication to treat DVT or PE, that's pulmonary embolism or deep vein thrombosis, and prevention of recurrence of these events. So that was the main efficacy endpoint, and that's the indication for this drug. At the same time, in the same study, they designed primary safety endpoints of major bleeding. And this drug was shown to be statistically superior to enoxaparin and warfarin on the major bleeding endpoints. So after first presenting the efficacy of the drug in Section 14, it made more sense to the review team to refer to Section 6 for the bleeding adverse reactions. Because even though this drug was found to be safer, statistically superior to enoxaparin and warfarin in having a reduced number of major bleeding events, adjudicated bleeding events, it still causes bleeding. So it's an adverse reaction. It made more sense to present this data in Section 6. So that's one example. And note that here in the example, if you've got pre-specified analyses and it's valid to present statistical information like p-values, feel free to do so. But if you didn't pre-specify, then the guidance would recommend that you omit this statistical testing because it would be misleading and hasn't been adjusted for. So here's another example, again, pre-specified safety endpoints embedded within a larger trial that was designed to demonstrate efficacy and win an approval for an efficacy of the drug. And in this particular drug, drug X compared to drug Y, it's actually a combination, but we're going to call it drug Y, it was shown to have statistically significant lower neuropsychiatric adverse events, reactions, compared to drug Y, or the combination. And you can see here it's not zero, so I don't know whether it's still an adverse reaction or not, probably is, but either way, because because it's potentially an adverse reaction, it could be included in Section 6, and it makes sense to put it here. And again, treatment difference and the statistical analyses are shown here and are valid to do so and are not misleading to present because they were pre-specified. And the study succeeded in demonstrating this hypothesis. So on the other side, an example of where safety turned into an indication. So here in this particular example, drug X actually has an indication for use to reduce major adverse cardiac events, or MACE, in patients with adults with type 2 diabetes mellitus and established cardiovascular disease. This is an actual indication based on safety. So here it made more sense to put it in section 14, clinical studies, where we typically put efficacy data. And here this is the data presented for the cardiovascular outcome trial in this population, and the statement here that drug X significantly reduced the occurrence of MACE, as shown in this Kaplan-Meier figure. Okay, post-marketing observational study data. This is not mentioned in regulations or guidance, so this is just a suggestion or a consideration for you if you decide to present observational study data. If you decide that it's essential information for the safe and effective use of the drug, because it may not be. If it meets that criteria for inclusion, you can consider putting it in section 6.2, post-marketing experience, and consider using these headings: adverse reactions from observational studies, as opposed to adverse reactions from post-marketing spontaneous reports. And again, this is based on differentiation into the different buckets and categories and headings and subsections, is based on the type of data or the quality of data is what we're getting at, rather than the timing or the source. And just as another note, post-marketing spontaneous reports, regardless of whether it's coming from your company database or FDA, reported directly to FDA, or from the published literature, they're considered to meet the requirement to report domestic and foreign spontaneous case reports under the post-marketing experience category. Okay, so this is the last topic: presenting adverse reaction information for non-indicated uses or dosages. So as you know, ordinarily the PI should be restricted to information related to approved indications and dosages, and that's to prevent the unintended suggestion of use in non-approved usages or dosages. And this principle is repeated numerous times throughout the regulations in different spots. Indications or uses must not be implied or suggested if they're not included in the INU section, and same for dosage and administration. There are some exceptions, however, and I think as Iris mentioned, when there's important information or risks for commonly prescribed or unapproved use that you want to highlight, even though it's not an approved usage, it's deemed sufficiently important enough that in case there's any off-label use out there and you want to warn people of what the potential risks or adverse reactions are, FDA can require, not in all cases, but do they need to be included, but FDA can require this information to be included in the labeling by regulation. Another exception for including adverse reaction data for non-indicated uses or dosages is commonly seen, not commonly, but sometimes seen when you have a drug where the safety database relies very heavily on a dosage that doesn't end up getting approved, and you have information for a smaller group whose dosage ends up being approved, and to present the safety data, you sort of need to borrow from the unapproved dosage. That sometimes that happens from pooled data, or I'll have examples that I can show. And so when you do this, if you have to do this, include a disclaimer if it's needed, so that people don't make the mistake of thinking that that data implies that you can use that drug for that unapproved usage or dosage. Here's an example. Here's the most extreme example. If you have a concern of usage that rises to the level of including it in a box warning, in this particular case, this is also a recently approved drug. This drug is contraindicated. This drug, first off, is approved for use in adults only. It's for irritable bowel syndrome with constipation, and but there was information from juvenile rats, I believe, young juvenile rats, that led to death, presumed to be due to dehydration. And so the concern that this drug might be used off-label, for instance, in these populations, might warrant including this information in the labeling. So this, in this case, is an extreme example. Again, it showed up in the box warning. Drug X is contraindicated in patients less than 6 years of age. Avoid use from 6 to 12. And then, again, the disclaimer that safety and effectiveness of Drug X has not been established in anyone less than 18. So if you have to, so in other words, if you have to include information and you don't want people to mistake it as approved use, include a disclaimer, and that's a common way to address that potential risk of misunderstanding. Here's the other scenario I was describing where most of the drug in this particular case, also recently approved, is coming from the lower dose, 10 milligrams per kilogram per day. The majority of patients received that regimen, and a much smaller portion received the higher dose of 20 milligrams per kilogram per day. But that ended up being the dosage that was recommended. And so when you go to develop Section 6, it's suboptimal to have a tiny subset that may not be able to present the whole or communicate the entire profile of adverse reactions. And so, well, this example has been modified a little bit. In this modified example, you can consider pooling data if it's appropriate, if your study designs are similar, sufficiently similar in design, population, treatment, or exposure. You can consider pooling the information and then presenting the information together, and then just including a clarification statement that the lower dose in this case is not approved, so that there's no misunderstanding. And finally, this is an example of presenting pooled information, including non-indicated usage, together with the select subgroup in which it's indicated. So in this case, it's pretty clear that the drug is indicated for cancer type C, and this provider population is not likely to mistaken the different cancer types and their approvals. So you may not need a disclaimer. And you can just say the safety of drug X was assessed, let's say, in a single-arm clinical trial that included 280 patients with various types of cancer, and then how many in that were the subset that is approved. So, okay, so in summary, so the labeling regulations identifies the information that's required and how to categorize it, but you have to use clinical judgment in the end to determine what specific data to include and how to present it. For example, when you're doing cutoffs and presenting non-indicated usage or dosages. And so finally, so consider the overall clinical message when you decide what to include and where to include it and how to present it. So it's a lot of judgment on your part in designing this section, and it's going to depend on the indication, the disease being treated, the drug safety profile, and various other factors. Okay, so the challenge question is, for adverse reactions with significant clinical implications, adverse reaction listings must be supplemented with information on which of the following? So A, nature, frequency, and severity of the adverse reaction. B, relationship of the adverse reaction to drug dose. C, relationship of the adverse reaction to demographic characteristics. Or D, all of the above if data are available and important. Okay, that's right. So. And these are some regulatory references. As I mentioned, the adverse reaction section guidance was what I was referring mostly to, but also clinical studies section has a little bit on that topic that I discussed about pre-specified safety endpoints, warnings and precautions, contraindications and box warning is another guidance, and the PLR implementation guidance talks about highlights and how to develop that section, including the adverse reaction section of highlights. Thank you, and that's the backup.
All right, thank you so much, Jeanne, and we've got plenty of time left for some Q&A. So again, if you have questions here in the room, please come on and line up at the microphones. We're gathering the online questions, but let's go ahead and start right here at microphone number 2. Nice and close for me, please.
Hi, thank you. My question is, can you expand on when it's useful to take into account investigator causality? Should we always avoid investigator causality? When do we take it into account and when should we not?
Thank you for that question. So the guidance of kind of in general just says to discourage that, but you're absolutely right. I agree with you that you wouldn't ignore that data, but you just you can use that information as a starting point, and then I guess, review the additional information across investigators. So for example, I think the reason why the guidance discourages that is that you don't want to have individual investigator bias. But if you've got the benefit of looking across the entire safety database and you can see across different regions and across different investigators their assessments, and they all are aligned with each other and they are aligned with your own assessment, then sure, you can use that. It's not that you can't use any investigator attributed information or opinion. I mean, that is of value, of course, because they do see the patients and they have the benefit of knowing what the circumstances are. So it's not, that's a good point. It's not to summarily say that you should ignore investigate, or why would we collect that data? So I agree with you, but it's not the automatic thing that you present without further processing.
Okay, microphone number 1, nice close for me, please. Sure.
Mark Shress, Ironwood Pharmaceuticals. Just wondering, for a drug that's approved 505(b)(2), is it relevant to put the post-market experience from the listed drug in that section?
You certainly can use that because it's from the same active ingredient, right? So that's from the same, not only the same pharmacologic class, but the same active ingredient. And assuming it's the same dosage form, but even if it's not, maybe it still is applicable. You certainly would, I would think that in general, that would be very useful information to include, especially if you haven't conducted your own studies and you're referring back to and relying on the safety, FDA's finding of safety in another drug product. Yeah.
One thing to think of is, as Jeanne was presenting it, with respect to adding adverse reactions from other programs. In general, we don't do that. However, if you have a small safety database for potentially a rare condition and you only have 100 patients in your trial, in that setting it may be important or useful to add additional adverse reactions. In contrast, if you have a cardiovascular trial with 20,000 patients, it's less likely that you'll need to add additional information from other related drugs in the class.
All right, let's go ahead and work in an online question, please.
The adverse reactions table, is there a preference for the table layout? Should the comparator be in the first column or the last column?
Yeah, there's no answer that I can give for that. There's no particular, well, that's a good thing though. That means that you can use your own discretion. No, that's a good question. That's your own personal preference whether to put, there's no particular, there's no regulation or or guidance recommendation that addresses that.
One suggestion for a related issue in terms of ordering treatment arms in columns. In general, if you have a regimen or a trial with many dosages, we recommend ordering it in order of lowest to highest. For example, placebo, low dose, medium dose, high dosage. Sometimes it's difficult, so you could read to see if there's a dosage-related effect, as opposed to low dose, high dose, medium dose, placebo. It's more difficult to read that. So think about that, ordering the columns with respect to reading to see if it's a dosage-related effect.
Assuming that both dosages are approved.
Okay, microphone number 2, please.
Yeah, hi, Tom Cantu from GSK. Just your thought process on if you have a drug that's already approved on the market for some time with clinical studies, adverse reactions, and post-marketing, and then later that active ingredient is incorporated into a combination, fixed-dose combination product. A couple of schools of thought at least, you bring everything over, or do you just bring over the serious things and then carefully consider the others as you go? This is assuming you have a big trial with the fixed-dose combination.
So if you've got a fixed combination drug, and if you have sufficient data for that combination, and you think that it represents, by and large, the most important events that you need to know for using that drug, which is going to be used as a combination, then you don't necessarily need to import all the information from the individual component drugs into that labeling. Otherwise, you would imagine that all the fixed combination drug labeling out there would be exactly twice, summing the two, A plus B, and it's going to be twice the length. You don't have to do that. And in fact, we would encourage, I would say, that to synthesize the information and present only the representative information, which is from the combination. And then you can use commentary to introduce additional adverse reactions that weren't already summarized in the combination use table. Does that answer your question? Yeah. That's a good question. That does come up frequently with combination drugs.
Okay, another microphone.
Hi, Alyssa Minkoff from Decipher Pharmaceuticals. So when deciding whether to include an AR from a similar class, if there is something serious seen from a drug in the same class, and if for your drug you haven't seen that yet, however it's a rare disease perhaps, and you have a small safety database, could it be enough to say that the other drug is not as selective and has some off-target toxicity that you don't have based on your preclinical data? Or would you be expected to kind of have further post-marketing safety and have a bigger safety database to rule that out definitively?
I think if you make the decision to include it in the labeling, you're already sort of making that, you've already committed to that assessment that it's possibly, at least possibly, or reasonably associated with the use of the drug. So you want to make sure that your messaging isn't confusing. If you decide on the one hand, you don't want to sort of hedge in one way and then another way, as if to say that you really don't know what's going on. If you don't really know and you don't think it's an adverse reaction, there's two ways you can handle it. If you think it's serious enough of an event that you need to warn people of the potential that it could happen, you could still present that. This type of scenario, I would imagine, would be resolved in Section 5, warnings and precautions, rather than Section 6. It sounds like your example describes something that would be a warning. And sometimes we do sometimes have labeling, let's say, for a drug that has a potential for increased malignancies, but it hasn't been observed, but we know from the mechanism of action that it's immunosuppressive. I have seen labeling examples where Section 5 will say that, it has a potential for increasing the incidence of malignancy, but then, the data just doesn't really support it. It's kind of neither here nor there. And you could use that as an approach to include that information from the other drug in the class before you actually know for sure and can rule that out, if it's sufficiently important and serious of an event. If it's not that important, I would probably think that you could wait until you actually develop a signal to include it in labeling. So it's always a balance between overwarning and underwarning. There's harms in both directions, so you sort of want to strike that balance as best as you can. That's a good question.
Okay, online question, please, Renew.
Where in the adverse reactions section are adverse reactions in the post-market setting added?
So as we mentioned, adverse reactions have to be categorized into two large buckets. The clinical trials experience described separately, that's where all the adverse reaction listings are in the form of a table or listings. And then separately, the post-marketing experience. So all of those spontaneous post-marketing, spontaneous US, domestic, or foreign reports would go under post-marketing experience. We typically use 6.1 and 6.2 as the sections for those categories, but they're not designated by regulation, unlike some of the other sections in labeling that have designated numbers. So if you have a particular drug that has the need to create lots of subsections in Section 6, or let's say a drug that's a biologic that has immunogenicity, that would go after clinical trials experience. So you'd have 6.1 clinical trials experience, 6.2 immunogenicity, 6.3 post-marketing experience. But to your question, where you would put post-marketing spontaneous reports, that would be 6.2 or whatever your section is for post-marketing experience.
To add to what Jeanne was saying now and also in her presentation, potentially you could have adverse reactions that occur during the post-marketing period, but they're from phase 4 studies. So they're adequate and well-controlled studies. That information would go in, if there are new adverse reactions, would go into the clinical trials experience subsection. On the other hand, you may have an NME obviously approved in the United States for the first time, but if there are spontaneous reports and the product was originally approved in Europe, those adverse reactions from spontaneous reports from Europe would go into the post-marketing experience subsection of the adverse reaction section. So as Jeanne mentioned in her talk, it has to do with the type of data, not the timing of when the adverse reaction occurred. Not the timing, and it doesn't have to do with the relationship of when the adverse reaction was collected with respect to the approval time.
Okay, microphone number 2, please.
So what if, you had mentioned that you only want to see those at an increased incidence in the active versus the comparator arm for a placebo-controlled trial. What if you have a double-blind placebo-controlled trial as an add-on to an active agent? So A plus or minus B, but the B is versus a placebo. And say you see actually a halving of an adverse event in the combination with your new agent, such that there's some kind of synergistic activity actually causing that adverse event, say diarrhea, to be reduced in frequency. Can that be in the adverse events table or section? Even though you haven't pre-specified or allocated alpha or, rigorously statistically evaluated that, but you're seeing, and it's not an adverse reaction to your drug, and you're seeing a halving of that. There's often interest, and it's also interesting to physicians that there's actually a reduction in those events. What would you say as the FDA in terms of guidance?
You certainly could make that argument if you believe in that scenario. It's not an adverse reaction, so it's not a causal relationship potentially. And if you could make that argument that there's a synergistic effect. And if you had that case, potentially you would not include that in the adverse reaction section. But I think that would be a case-by-case determination to see the basis of that argument. But certainly you could make that argument.
Okay, next online question, please.
Is the adverse reactions profile discussion focused only on events with reasonable association of causality with the drug?
So ideally, yes. As the regulations stipulates, the entire premise is that we're dealing with things that are at least reasonably associated with use of the drug, and not things that have been ruled out as unrelated or probably not related to the drug. So ideally, yes. I don't know if there's more to that question that maybe could be rephrased to be more of a yes, but
Since that was an online question, that's
Okay.
exactly what it was. Next online question, please.
Okay. If fatal cases for an adverse reaction are mentioned in the warning and precautions section, how does FDA recommend the fatal aspect in the adverse reactions be communicated in the adverse reactions section?
well, so in the beginning of Section 6, before you even get to Section 6.1, it's required that all adverse reactions that are mentioned in the warnings and precautions section are referenced. So there's a cross-reference where there are the serious or otherwise clinically significant adverse reactions. The reference is made back to Section 5. So you don't have to rehash the entire discussion over in Section 6. Section 6's purpose is more to display the common adverse reactions. You might still include those reactions that ended up being fatal adverse reactions in the context of that table. so you know where its frequency sits in relation to the other common adverse reactions. And then, as the regulations requires, below the table, you would go into commentary on important adverse reactions. You could then cross-reference, if you want, at that point, back to Section 5, where that discussion about the fatal adverse reactions is more expressed in more detail and elaborated on.
Okay, and we've got just 2 minutes left. Let's go with one more online question, please.
Are post-marketing adverse reactions ever included in the highlight section of the prescribing information?
That's a good question. Usually not. So the purpose of the adverse reactions heading and highlights is to bring out the most common adverse reactions that were seen above a certain incidence. And so that's going to be mostly derived from a clinical trial where you can actually calculate that incidence. From post-marketing data, you don't know the denominator, you don't know the numerator, the denominator, it's an uncertain population. So I'm not sure how much confidence you would have in those rates that you have. And you don't know where you would place that in relation to the other percentages that did make that cut from clinical trials. So, but to that point, to that question though, if you have serious or important adverse reactions that surface in the post-marketing period, the place where you might highlight that is the warnings and precautions heading of highlights. So that's a space where you can place anything important that you want to warn people of, and not be restricted to, you know, the requirement to only furnish information above a certain cutoff. That's just anything important that you want to highlight in the warnings and precautions section.
Okay, and that is all the time we have for questions. Please help me thank Jeanne and Eric.